So now we have a version of our scene with just redshift materials and lights. I've gotten rid of mantra here, and we're now just working with redshift. Let's go ahead and set off an IPR, see where we're at to start. And we have this. So what I'd like to do to start is let's bring up this exposure, maybe -6, and we'll say -7. And I know you can't see this, so let me do this. I'll just make another tab here, redshift render view, and there we go. Now you can see it. Okay, so we have that going on. That's fine. Let's go now to our material and create something for our fire. So redshift material builder. We'll call this our flames material again. And assign that to pyro imports. Drag that in. Inside of here, we want a redshift volume. And plug that into volume. Okay, let's go ahead and re-kick this and set our visibility down here to this pyro import so that now our flame should start showing up. Let's also uncheck any of these post-processing effects right now to be sure that that's not influencing what we see here. And now that we have this, we can start dialing in this volume shader. These top two sections deal with density and smoke, and it's really only this bottom emission section that's going to be responsible for our flames. All we need to say here is heat, and then restart this, and that should give us fire to work with. Just as we did before, let's remap our range here. So let's go to advanced and say that our old minimum is 0, old max is 0.9. And let's go over here to this emission section, change the scale to something like 30. And there we go. We have something that looks very familiar. Let's create the same ramp that you saw before. So we'll do something a bit like this. Let's make this yellow. Let's go down here, make this red. And then we'll just start trying to dial in some of these values. For the red, let's desaturate this and then bring it closer to yellow by going like that. So now we have this. Let's bring that over and let's do a very similar thing where we did this whole thing. I want to make this a bit more red actually. So let's go right there, bring down the blue a little bit. Okay, so now we have this kind of thing going on, which is good. And once you have the ramp set up like this, then go back to the advanced tab and change this new max to something else. And let's bring this up. As we bring this up, we start seeing that whole pocketed effect happen again. So shift drag, and let's just keep an eye out for those pockets to show up. So it starts to happen right about there. And I think this would be a good value at about 2. So let's say 2 for that. And then we can go back here, bring up our heats. Let's try maybe 40 on that. We'll just middle mouse and drag this until we start clipping a fair bit. So I'd say right about there is good. Let's then bring this up a little bit and go like that. I think that's looking just a little bit better. I don't want to do that. Hold on, undo that. Okay, so yeah, I think something around here will work pretty nicely. Let's leave it at that for right now. We can always come back to it. And now that we have that, I mean, this fire looks pretty similar. Let's introduce motion blur. So let's go to our pyro imports. Redshift OBJ, under the volume tab, we have this use velocity grids. So check that. It's going to cause motion blur based on velocity and set the scale to 3. Once you have that, then go to the out context, go to the ROP, and for the ROP, go to motion blur, enable motion blur, and I think it's fine at these default settings. Also, I forgot to mention in the Redshift ROP, it's really important to go to your GI and use brute force for this. So you can use brute force one bounce like that, it's fine. You can do secondary bounces as well. So just do brute force for both, and that will allow the smoke to be illuminated by the emission of the flames. Let's just go with only the primary for right now. I think that's okay. And then for the optimization, also set our reflections down to 2 so that there's only a combined of 2. We don't have any refraction and we really don't have any reflections happening in the scene, so we don't need to spend too much time thinking about those bounces. Okay, now that we have motion blur, GI, all that stuff happening, let's re-kick this out. And now we have something like this. I think now would be a great time to adjust some of these post-processing effects. I really love these post-processing effects, by the way. They're very convenient. So let's go to the LUT, turn that on. I like using this AFCA Color Futura 200. That catchy name, right? It does something to unify the color palette just a little bit more. And I just like what it does to the image. Just be sure that you check the Apply Color Management before LUT. And there you go. Let's check on the color controls. I don't think we'll do a whole lot here. We might, never mind. I think this is fine. Maybe bring the exposure down just a little bit, -0.1. Let's now go to our photographic exposure here, and we want a full vignette. So we'll crank that up. And I think that this is fine. The allowed overexposure is a cool way of controlling the really bright spots along here. So if you pay attention to the white areas, we just want to bring this back just a little bit, maybe right about there. We also have this black crush, which is a cool way of adding more general values to everything, or like more contrast, I should say, to the shadow areas. So if we have a threshold that goes up, let's just go up a tad bit on that, and we bring up this amount, we can just add a bit more contrast to the image. Let's go right about there. Our saturation's a tad bit high. Let's try 0.98 right there. Bloom, this is going to be a cool effect. So this will make our campfire glow a bit more. Let's bring up the intensity really high like that. Let's also turn up the softness. And then we will dial back this threshold until we're just hitting those really bright areas. So bring back the softness, so we're right about there. And then gradually bring back up this intensity so that we get something like that. So before, after. Pretty cool. Now let's go to flare. Flare just adds this little lens thing, which I think looks pretty cool. Let's just turn down the intensity on that so it's just barely there, right there. And then for this streak, I like making the streaks a little bit more closed in than the bloom. So let's turn up the streaks. You can see we have this. Let's turn down the tail so that we have a short tail on that. We can turn up the softness just a little bit. And then let's figure out a good threshold. So I want to just target those clipping areas like right about there. And then let's bring up the number of streaks just a tad bit, set it to 0, and then just bring it up just a tad bit, like that. Okay, so before, after with the streak, there's the flare, we have bloom, there's our exposure, and our LUT. I also decided to change up this camera angle. And another thing that helped out this scene quite a bit is in the material, I painted out an emission texture map for the logs. So if you go to the logs here, what I have going on is basically this texture right here, which is this emission color. And that's being multiplied against an attribute that I painted, this emiss weight, to paint where this emission is allowed to happen. So if we go to the logs, right here in this campfire geo, all I did, again, was just paint this out. So you paint that, that's where the emiss weight is coming from, and that's pretty much how I did that. So it doesn't really show, there it is. Okay, so that's the map that I painted out, or that's the attributes. The emission weight attribute that I painted out. So there's that. And then also on the embers, I just turned this into this color right here and added a little bit of emission there as well. So after doing that, this is what I came up with. So here's a fully clean render. You can see right towards the bottom here, that's where that emission map is really helping the bottom of this log look bright and fiery. And then we don't really see much of the embers. We see a little bit shining through right there. But yeah, there you go. I mean, I think it's about that. I also repositioned some of the rocks so that this could be framed in nicely. Okay, well, in the last video, I want to add some closing thoughts real fast, and we will leave it at that.